Dear students, as we have discussed in the previous class, international economics deals with the flow of goods, services, factors of production, etc. between nations, and it deals with economic and financial interdependence between nations. So, as international economics deals with the flow of goods and services between nations, an important question in this context is, why did economies, different nations of the world, engage in international trade in the first place? A nation or an individual will engage in trade, exchange, if and only if it is gainful to him. So the question we discuss in this session is, when did the idea of gains from trade first emerge? When did the idea of gains from trade first emerge? And how did the views on trade change in the 18th century? How did the views on trade change in the 18th century? Now, we start with the first systematic writings on international economics, its implications, and ideas about gains in trade contained in the writings of mercantilists. Mercantilist theory of trade. So, in this session, we will discuss mercantilist theory of trade. That is the earliest idea about trade is contained in the writings of mercantilist school of thought, a school of thought emerged in the early 15th century. So, the question is, when did the idea of gains from trade first emerge, and how did the ideas underwent a change in the 18th century in the writings of classical economists? So, some of the earliest ideas on international trade is contained in the writings of mercantilist school of thought. And later, these ideas were challenged by the members of classical economics, or the mercantilist idea of international trade was challenged by the classical economists like Adam Smith, Ricardo, etc. Now, the challenges culminated in the work of Ricardo, and Ricardo's theory on international trade, known as comparative cost advantage, is still the basic theory of international trade. Comparative cost advantage, introduced by Ricardo, is still the cornerstone of what is known as the theories of international trade. Now, the basic questions that we seek to answer are: 1. What is the basis of trade? What is the basis of trade? And what are the gains from trade? What is the basis of trade and what are the gains from trade? Remember this, a nation will voluntarily engage in trade only if it is beneficial. Only if it is beneficial to the nation. So the question is, what is the basis of trade? And what are the gains from trade? This is the first question that we wish to answer. But the question is how the gains are generated. How the gains are generated. And how large are the gains? And how the gains are divided among nations. So the first question is, what is the basis of trade? What are the gains? And how gains are generated, and also how the gains are distributed among nations. That is the first question we wish to consider. The second is, what is the pattern of trade? The second question we wish to answer is, what is the pattern of trade? Pattern of trade means what commodities are traded. That is, which commodities are exported and which commodities are imported. So the questions are, what is the pattern of trade? First, what is the basis of trade? What are the gains from trade? And the second question is, what is the pattern of trade? Pattern of trade means what commodities are exported and what commodities are imported. To give a sense of historical development of international trade theory and to provide a basis for evaluating current trade policy arguments that are clearly mercantilist in nature, we examine the important ideas of mercantilists to give a historical perspective on the development of trade theory, and also to give a sound basis to the current trade policies which are basically mercantilist in character. We examine the important ideas of mercantilists, the deficiencies, the problems associated with their thinking on international economics, and also the emergence of different views on trade, especially Smith and Ricardo. So in this session we will consider the basic mercantilist ideas on trade and also the problems with their ideas. And in the subsequent classes we will discuss the alternative to mercantilist trade theories offered by classical economists Adam Smith and Ricardo. Now, as it is well known to you from your courses in history of economic thought, mercantilism simply refers to the collection of economic thoughts that came into existence in Europe during the period 1500 and 1750 AD. Mercantilism is a collection of economic thoughts that came into existence in Europe during the period 1500 AD to 1750 AD. And it is not a formal school of thought, rather a collection of similar attitudes towards domestic economic activity and the role of international trade that tended to dominate economic thinking and policy during this period. So, mercantilism is not a formal school of thought. Rather, it is a collection of similar attitudes towards domestic economic policy and the role of international trade that tended to dominate economic thinking and policy during 1500 to 1750. Now, let us see what are the central ideas of mercantilists about international trade. Now, the central to mercantilist thinking was the view that national wealth is reflected in a country's holding of precious metals. National wealth, precious of a country is reflected in the holding of precious metals. In addition, one of the most important pillars of economic thought was static view of world resources. Static view of world resources. One of the pillars of mercantilist thought was static view of world resources. Means world resources are constant. World resources are constant. And the wealth of a nation is reflected in the stock of precious metals. Naturally, it happens that economic activity in this setting is a zero-sum game. Zero-sum game in which the gain of one nation is at the expense of another nation or at the expense of other nations. If world resources are static and that is given, cannot be increased, and if a nation's wealth is viewed as its holding of precious metals, then economic activity is a zero-sum game. Means one country's gain is at the expense of another country. And the acquisition of precious metals, as precious metals is synonymous with the national wealth, acquisition of precious metals is the means of increasing wealth and well-being, and it has become the focus of emerging European nations. Emerging European nations. That is, as wealth is synonymous with the precious metals, acquisition of precious metals has become the primary objective of emerging European nations. So, naturally, in a hostile world, as one nation's gain is at the expense of another nation, the world is hostile. So, in a hostile world, the enhancement of state power is critical to growth process. And this was another important mercantilist doctrine, that is enhancement of state power. Enhancement of state power is critical to economic growth. So a strong army and also a strong navy, and also a strong navy are critical for increasing state power. Critical for increasing state power. And finally, mercantilists also stressed the need to maintain a surplus of exports over imports. Mercantilists also favored surplus of exports over imports. That is a positive trade balance. Positive or favorable trade balance. Mercantilists favored a positive trade balance. And this doctrine is emerged from considering wealth as synonymous with the acquisition of precious metals. Acquisition of precious metals and maintenance of a sizable war chest to maintain a huge army. To maintain a huge army. And the inflow of precious metals known as specie. The inflow of precious metal from foreigners. If a nation maintain a balance of export over imports, there will be inflow of specie in the form of gold and silver. And this inflow is an important source of money to countries constrained by shortage of coinage. So, attainment of positive trade balance is economically beneficial to the country. So, remember this, since excess of exports over import is necessary for the inflow of specie, precious metals, and since every nation cannot attain excess of exports over imports simultaneously, there is a possibility of conflict between nations. So they preached what is known as economic nationalism. They preached economic nationalism. Because they believed that economic or national interests are basically in conflict. So these are the ideas of mercantilists. Mercantilists identified wealth with precious metals. They considered international trade as a zero-sum game. They preached what is known as positive trade balance, and it ensures inflow of precious metals, species. So these ideas of mercantilists resulted in what is known as mercantilist ideas on trade policies, or what to say, the economic policies pursued by the mercantilists followed from these basic doctrines. Government, the first one is government controlled the use and exchange of precious metals, which is referred to as bullionism. Government controls the use and exchange of precious metals. That is, countries attempted to prohibit export of gold, silver and other precious metals by individuals, because precious metals were identified as synonymous with national wealth. A second one is governments attempted to control international trade with policies which increases the likelihood of positive trade balances and inflow of species. That is, governments attempted to control international trade in such a way that the policies are supposed to ensure positive trade balance and hence inflow of species. So exports were subsidized and imports were discouraged by tariffs, import duties. And a third one is trade with the colonies were fostered, because colonies were considered as sources of cheap raw materials and also market for finished goods. So from these basic ideas, during the period of mercantilism, government controlled what is known as the exchange of precious metals. Government adopted policies which ensure positive trade balance to ensure inflow of species, and colonization, as colonies were a source of raw material and a market for finished goods, were encouraged. These were the basic ideas of mercantilism on international trade. A school of thought, or rather a loose school of thought, existed in Europe between 1500 to 750 AD, or 1750 AD. And some of these policies, initially preached by mercantilists, still exist in different parts of the world, that we will discuss in the subsequent classes.